Hello and welcome to the ITPro Podcast. I'm Adam Shepherd.
And I'm Jane McCallion.
Now, Jane, it's a bit of a special episode this week, isn't it?
It is. So we have chosen this week to take the opportunity to do a special episode to look back at the year gone by, the biggest stories and trends.
Now, one of the biggest stories that has dominated the news recently has been the general election. But given that we are around a week into the new Conservative government's term, there's not really a huge amount that we can say about that, certainly at this point. What we can do, however, is look back at the events that have led up to it, particularly the furore around Brexit and the tech sector.
Well, it's still going to be a theme next year as well, because of course the new Brexit date is supposed to be 2020.
Allegedly.
Yes, but looking back, well, actually, you make a very good point there, because of course one of the problems that businesses have faced when it comes to Brexit is the uncertainty. The deadline keeps being changed. What the rules are going to be keeps being changed. And this has caused major problems for the skills gap because people are wary of coming here. Businesses are wary of investing in bringing people over here when they could need to sponsor new kinds of visas. And the IT department always gets a bit of a kicking whenever budgets are scrutinised and people are drawing in their waistbands a bit. And for small businesses, our colleague Kumar's Afifi Sabet wrote in September about small businesses being unprepared for a no-deal Brexit. And I think it was a very legitimate concern at the time and will continue to be. But at the same time, as I say, if the goalposts keep moving, how do you prepare for something that is completely undefined?
Exactly, and I think that's one of the big problems that businesses have had is that we've had 3 different Brexit dates so far this year.
Yeah.
Another issue has been the lack of awareness around things like data sovereignty rights and data residency and data transfer between the UK and the EU post Brexit. Our deputy editor Dale Walker did a big feature earlier this year about a European Court of Justice case which could actually make it illegal for businesses in the UK to share data with EU partners.
Yeah, and this could be a very serious problem. I am going to end up mentioning the cliche of data is the new oil. I hate it, but data flows are super important for businesses of all kinds. We are a technology publication, but technology is part of all kinds of every kind of business, pretty much, unless you are a crofter. The problem of an interruption of data flow between the EU and the UK, or the UK and everywhere else, it could be a huge problem. So it's one of those other little niggly bits that need to be sorted out before we leave, if we leave.
Speaking of data and speaking of leaving, various political parties, including the Brexit Party, have found themselves in hot water with the ICO over their use of data. So the ICO is currently investigating the Brexit Party for their use of personal data in campaigning. Labour also reported a data breach to the ICO after several of its MPs split off to join the party now known as Change UK and took various data sets with them, such as constituency data and things like that. The ICO has warned politicians in general against misusing data in the election that will have just gone by the time this goes to air.
The funny thing is, when you talk about that Labour story, it does make me wonder actually about the Computer Misuse Act, in that people are really kind of ignorant of it and they don't know that you can't just actually make off with data because you think, it's my constituency data or it's data that I've normally had access to, therefore I'm not stealing it, I'm not hacking, and not realising actually they're committing a crime. Speaking of crimes though, and most recently, our colleague and staff writer Bobby Hellard has written about the fact that the Canadian data watchdog has said that Aggregate IQ, which was deeply involved in the Brexit referendum, working with Vote Leave in particular, broke data regulations over there in the ways that they were working with targeting people on Facebook in particular. So it's another targeted ads thing. And this company is also related to Cambridge Analytica, a name which you may recognise from previous Brexit-related scandals through the Strategic Communications Laboratories, also known as SCL Group. So yes, that's all very intertwined, and there has been, I think it's one of those things, nothing happens without data now, and so it's kind of unsurprising that our politics is increasingly influenced by online information, whether legitimately or illegitimately.
Yeah, I think the Brexit referendum in particular gave a lot of politicians, or a lot of parties, I should say, a bit of a heads up that data could be used in these kinds of ways. And I think particularly around social media, the Conservatives and Labour to a certain extent, but the Conservatives particularly, have really been focusing a lot of their energy on social media compared to the last election.
Yeah, you're right, definitely.
So speaking of data and the ICO, GDPR has been a major focus this year. It was a big focus last year, obviously, as the first year that it was officially in force. But the fines for the new regulations, the big, meaty, maximum value fines that people were expecting / dreading, delete as appropriate, have finally started to come down. The biggest fine to date has been the £183 million penalty levied by the ICO against British Airways for a cyber attack last year that affected 500,000 customers.
Yes, or in fact 2 cyber attacks. The first that affected 380,000 and then a further 185,000 later in the year. However, the fine was only levied in 2019 in July.
Shortly after that, of course, days after that, in fact, Marriott was also fined £99 million for its own data breach, which occurred last year in 2018, affecting approximately 339 million guests.
That's, if I were a Marriott guest, I would have been somewhat concerned about that. The thing is that in terms of GDPR, while £183 million sounds like an awful lot of money, it could be a lot more. In fact, it could be double that, because 183 million is only 1.5% of BA's annual turnover. And the top end for GDPR fines is 4% of annual global turnover. So,
or 20 million, whatever's higher.
Well, yes, it clearly tops out the 20 million mark, but and indeed that's 20 million euro.
Yes.
So it looks big.
But it could have been
much bigger.
Yeah, it could have been more than double. But the key thing is that the multi-million £/ fines for these kind of GDPR violations and data breaches are now starting to come down, and they're not going away. If anything, we will only see them increase over the next year or so, and there's been a lot of fines from the ICO and other data protection authorities under the new rules. So anyone who was hoping they could skate by without changing their practices too much, based on the evidence of the past year, is in for a bit of a rude awakening.
While we might get close to that top end of fines, it is worth remembering that under the previous data protection regulations in this country, the ICO never issued a maximum fine. It had capabilities much higher than it ever used. So whether we will ever see anything more than, say, 2%, that kind of remains to be seen, I guess. Although, yeah, we are at the time of recording 18 months, more or less exactly 18 months into GDPR. So there's definitely time for it to get bigger.
It's also worth noting that the EU has spent this year cracking down on big tech firms like Facebook and Google, often under GDPR grounds, but not exclusively. The EU has also started going after companies for tax evasion, much more stringently. Like stuff like Facebook's Libra cryptocurrency, which is faced resistance from the US, but also has faced very strong opposition from the EU, who have multiple questions. Margareta Vestager, who is the EU's competition chief, has expressed some kind of severe questions about Facebook's potential for kind of monopolization, effectively.
Yes, and she has been quite a big crusader in terms of taking on the tech giants for many, many years. Since probably before I joined ITPro, but definitely, for a long time since I've been here.
Right, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we will be talking about the last year in security, as well as some of the other most interesting stories that have cropped up. See you after the break.
Hello, I'm Ollie Mann, and every Friday on The Week Unwrapped, we cover the stories you might have missed with journalists from theweek.co.uk. It's all the big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. That's The Week Unwrapped with me, Ollie Mann, available now for free from all good podcast apps.
Welcome back. And so a perennial topic to talk about, but one which has lots of permutations. Security.
Everyone loves some security.
Everyone does. Now, we were talking off mic, actually, with our publisher, Paul Franklin, about the fact that this year, probably very happily for most of our listeners, there's been nothing kind of big newsy like WannaCry, for example, stage fright, any of those kind of big headline grabbing things that we had for several years in a row. But that's not to say that things are steady and nothing's happening at all, is it?
No, quite. One big and honestly particularly worrying trend that has flown somewhat under the radar as far as the general public is concerned is the growth of ransomware hitting local governments. There have been a number of kind of quite severe outbreaks. Texas was hit by a wide-ranging malware attack across its public sector and government institutions, as was Louisiana, and global ransomware attacks on public infrastructure in general have been up quite massively across the board.
Yeah, I do wonder why this is, because, I mean, I'm not 100% au fait with local government in the US, I will admit. But I wonder if it's not similar to here, which is that budgets are restricted and there's only so much money that you have, and it's very difficult to find the skills, it's very difficult to find the money to protect yourself. And I note that Louisiana and Texas are both red states, which means they are low tax states, so it wouldn't surprise me if the money issue is a bit of a problem there as well.
Yeah, I mean, as we discussed in episode 2 of this very podcast, in fact, with PC Pro's Darian Graham-Smith, it can be quite a challenge to keep computers and IT infrastructure effectively patched against ransomware, particularly when it's so quick to evolve and mutate and for new strains to emerge. So it's not a surprise in some ways that public sector organisations don't put that at the top of their priority list, but at the same time, given the important role that these organisations have in managing our day-to-day lives and keeping us safe and keeping the water and power running and all this kind of stuff, it's worrying to see kind of outbreaks on this scale.
It's a difficult balancing act, but once again, if you are an IT professional, unless you are particularly public spirited, are you going to go for the job in the public sector that pays you, pulling a number out of the air, 30 grand, or are you going to go for the one in the private sector that pays you 60 grand?
Well, quite.
However, I'll tell you something that's come up that's really interesting, and I had to name check our deputy editor Dale Walker again. He in October wrote about a new study that showed the most popular ransomware strains targeting UK businesses by geography in the UK.
Which is a level of detail that you don't often get.
No, and so not only is there variation by geography, as in like Europe, North America and stuff, But within here, you find that looking at different kinds of ransomware, in Manchester, the one known as Grand Crab is just overwhelmingly the largest. I can only recommend, we'll have in the show notes a link to this story. Go and check it out, because the graphs just show how much variation there is. In Manchester, Grand Crab makes up sort of 90%, whereas in Leeds, in Reading, it just doesn't exist. It's not targeting businesses there at all. So there is also, it's hard to say whether it's targeting or whether it happens to be that companies in those locations are running certain types of systems, for example, and they interact with each other. Obviously, there's a local business ecosystem.
Which actually brings us quite neatly onto another major trend from this year, which is a pretty precipitous rise in supply chain attacks, including tactics like island hopping. So 50% of cyber attacks now use island hopping as part of their attack strategy, which was according to a Carbon Black study from earlier this year.
Can you explain for a moment just what exactly island hopping is?
Sure. So island hopping is essentially where attackers will target one of a company's partners or suppliers in order to find a route into their eventual end target. And you can find more information in the show notes, including some in-depth investigations we've run into the kind of role that island hopping plays in cyber attacks, including a webinar featuring yours truly. But in short, it's becoming incredibly popular, because even if you as a company are protected up to the hilt, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of the organisations you work with will be similarly protected.
It makes me wonder how it's taken so long for this to take off, because this kind of supply chain attack is a known vector. There are many theories as to how Stuxnet got into uranium enrichment plants, but one of the top ones now is that it was via a supply chain attack, because the computer that was initially infected was air-gapped. And so, maybe it's a technical thing that, nation states have been able to do this for a while, but it's taken cyber criminals a bit longer to actually get the tools and nous to get on with it. So while over here Brexit may be causing people to not invest, in the US in particular, legacy vendors are splashing the cash all over the place in order to bolster their capabilities and their businesses. So a couple of notable ones: Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, HPE, bought Cray, also known as Cray Computing, for $1.3 billion. Now, Cray in itself is a venerable company, but I think it shows that HPE, while they've not quite done anything with it yet, are pivoting towards really incorporating high-performance computing capabilities into their portfolio, especially when you consider that they bought SGI a couple of years back as well.
Similarly, the Red Hat acquisition closed this year. IBM now officially owns Red Hat, and it's using it to beef up its cloud capabilities. Similarly, VMware acquired Pivotal and Carbon Black. Carbon Black is being used to power more security-centric products and capabilities throughout its portfolio, whereas Pivotal is being used to expand the cloud development ecosystem within VMware and its customer base. So it's all these acquisitions really being used to fuel kind of expansion into new areas of technology compared to the kind of previous on-prem quote-unquote legacy environments.
It's worth pointing out as well, with the VMware acquisition of Carbon Black, we're talking about a double legacy here, given that VMware is majority owned by Dell, and so they are involved in this whole kind of acquisition chain as well. It'll be interesting to see where that goes come the following year.
So moving on from that, there were a few other trends that it's worth talking about. Windows 7 is rapidly approaching end of life, which is leading to effectively crunch time for a lot of organizations who are having to effectively plan their migration to Windows 10 or to Windows 8 if they're feeling particularly brave. So when Microsoft has given Windows 7 users an extra year of support beyond the previous end date for extended support. But it's still going to be a bit of a struggle, I think, for a lot of businesses to plan that migration. Migrations are notoriously difficult, particularly from Windows 7 to Windows 10. The Met Police had a particular drama with that.
Well, also, let's not forget that one of the reasons why WannaCry was so prevalent in the public sector, and notably the NHS, is because Windows 7 is so widely used there. So, I mean, hopefully it's not going to be the same kind of everyone run around with your hair on fire that XP was. But, yeah, hopefully is possibly the operative word there.
Speaking of healthcare, there have been a number of health scares around the growing deployment of 5G. Of course, this year was the year that 5G properly made it to the UK. Vodafone, O2 and EE all have fully featured 5G networks live. 3 has a home broadband-based 5G offering. And there have been a number of backlashes to this kind of growing trend.
So yes, our erstwhile colleague Connor Jones wrote recently about what is known as the 5G health scare. I mean, basically people are worried about it because it's millimetre wave radiation. I think the word radiation is possibly what is worrying everyone. At the same time, 5G is actually less powerful in many respects than its predecessors. A normal brick wall will defend you from 5G in many cases. I think the problem is as well, there's going to be a lot more 5G masts for the reasons just specified. It's much weaker.
Yeah.
So there is nothing to worry about, friends and colleagues. Like I say, that you can read Connor's piece on it.
I mean, I remember when there were stories similar to this about mobile phones in general, that mobile phones would give you ear cancer and the like, which of course has yet to materialise, despite the fact that mobile phones have been around for multiple decades.
Actually, if you want a good overview of how this does all work, the Gimlet Media podcast Science Versus did an entire episode on why you don't need to worry about it.
So unfortunately, that's all we've got time for this episode. We will be off next week for the Christmas break. We hope you enjoy it, and we will be back in the first week of January, looking forward to 2020 and what exciting delights that will bring.
You can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes, and even more on our website, www.itpro.co.uk.
Don't forget to follow ITPro on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, subscribe to the newsletter, and subscribe to the ITPro Podcast on your podcast platform of choice. You can also follow us on Twitter at ITPro, as well as Facebook and LinkedIn.
Don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you get podcasts to never miss an episode.
Have a good Christmas, and we will see you in 2020.
Bye.
Bye.